Thanks to every one of the collaborators in Compass and the colleagues who've supported me, and also thanks to the agencies that have graciously supported my research. So today I will be sharing with you part of what I've been working on in the last couple of years, which is really trying to use geophysics to image soil or improve our understanding of the soil systems. Classically, I mean, and when people hear of geophysics, they think about the classical imaging that we do for either mining purposes, deeper geological investigation, so on and so forth. But of recent, there've been really increased attention on using geophysics to improve understanding of the critical zone, and basically that is what it's motivating my research to use geophysics to look at soils, particularly soils around these coastal interfaces, and that's what I'll be sharing with you. Just as a background, I wanted to also mention that really I'm a geophysicist with a strong interest in hydrology. So sometimes my work cuts across not just the geophysical imaging aspect, but I'm also interested in subsurface hydrology. But for today's research, I will be focusing on just the geophysical imaging of the shallow subsurface, in this case, soil systems across a coastal interface. For today's presentation, I want you to take note of the word wanted to. I wanted to talk on 3 themes, but I realized that I may not have the time to really touch on all 3 of them. However, I will try. If I don't get to it, feel free to ask me a question on any 3 of them when we enter the Q&A session. I probably have a backup slide on it. So the first theme I wanted to show was the simple use of geophysics to characterize spatial variation in soil properties. I am sure as scientists who are interested in coastal systems or soils across the coastal interface, we sometimes saddled with the responsibility or have need to understand how soil texture, as simple as it is, vary across the soils that we are working on. Or it may even go as far as saturation, water content, how it is changing, or organic matter content, salinity, and even the redox potential. So the first thing I wanted to focus on is to see how do we use geophysics to characterize spatial variation in soil properties, and I'll be focusing on moisture content, organic matter, and texture. The second theme I wanted to talk about is if we could use geophysics to monitor changes in soil saturation and salinity. This is something that the ag folks were much interested in earlier, but now that we've started looking more critically at soils across the coastal interface, we found out that salinity and saturation typically vary temporally and spatially within these soils, because if you think about a flooding system as a result of a rise in sea level or even tidal effects that bring in salt water, estuary water landward, by the time the water recedes, you will find out that there will be some percolating water that will increase moisture content and also salinity. Then the last thing I wanted to talk on was the need to improve how we measure, or at least to complement how we measure redox potential changes, and if it is possible to improve on our improve on how we quantify spatial variation in redox potential. So let me start with the first one, and I want to emphasize the use of, or I want to focus on how we're using electrical imaging to map wetland soil properties at a large spatial scale. And the question in my mind is usually asking if there is a strong relationship between soil electrical signatures, such as electrical conductivity or induced polarization, if there's a relationship between these 2 geophysical quantities and soil moisture, organic matter, or even the soil texture. If we find a very strong relationship, that may give us an opportunity to explore using these these geophysical quantities that we can easily measure at a large spatial scale, we can use them to predict these properties of the soil that we sometimes are interested in but cannot measure at the high spatial resolution that we are interested in. So I want to show you a case application that I worked in with my student, Efemena, earlier on at the University of Toledo. So first, I wanted to show you the electromagnetic imaging method that we use to map electrical conductivity of soils. A simple instrument that consists of a transmitter and a receiver. What the transmitter simply sends into the soil or release is an electromagnetic wave. Electromagnetic means it has electrical component and a magnetic component. That when it gets into the soil, because the soil contains materials or has properties that allow it to serve as a conductor, generates eddy currents that induce a secondary electromagnetic field. And with that secondary electromagnetic field, because we know the primary electromagnetic field that we injected, if we pick two of them, we can estimate what the conductivity of the subsurface is and even say something about the magnetic susceptibility of the soil. And this instrument here is the simple conductivity meter that we could use to do this measurement. So the instrument contains a transmitter and two receivers that are spaced from this transmitter at two different distances. One is at 50 centimeter and the other one is 1 meter. So now that means if I can just I just hold this equipment, the conductivity meter, move it around, I can cover a particular area, or I can even tow it behind a vehicle and allow me to cover a large area. So it depends on how easy it is. I mean, like I showed before, you may also tow it behind a utility terrain vehicle if you are in difficult terrains. So depending on where you are, you can either do that by hand, so on and so forth. So what I want to be showing you today is really result of electrical conductivity distribution at this site that we measured. Now, in addition to the electrical conductivity measurement, electrical conductivity distribution, we also took soil samples, which you're seeing here labeled SD1 to SD22. They are just soil locations where we collected soil sample using the bulk density sampler that allows us to take soil samples to the laboratory and do some physiochemical analysis to come up with texture, organic matter content, measure the moisture content in the laboratory. Our goal is really to compare what the geophysicist is seeing and what the properties that we measure in the lab. If there is a relationship that is strong enough, then we should be able to use geophysics or electrical imaging at this in this context as a proxy for predicting the spatial distribution of these soil properties. So this is conductivity distribution that we measured at this site that I just showed you. The site is actually around the Lake Erie region. So the site name is named Defiance, a little upland in the Lake Erie region. Now, but the upper part figure you see, the left-hand side of this figure, the upper part is basically showing the apparent electrical conductivity distribution at the site. And the lower one is still apparent electrical conductivity, but now you're seeing a sensor that is 1 meter away from the transmitter. That tells you that we are seeing a deeper investigation volume compared to the shallow one. While on the right-hand side, you're seeing distribution of apparent magnetic susceptibility of the soil. I mean, these results were fantastic because you could really see this shallow soil show some differences in the magnetic susceptibility distribution. Now, one thing we did was to compare the geophysical imaging to what soil scientists typically would refer to, which is a soil map of an area, and we wanted to check how we're doing. And if you look at it, it looks like our geophysical methods practically is able to replicate the soil map, and we can assume that if this is true, then most likely we can assume that the variation in geophysical signals that we are seeing reflect changes in the soil, because here we're able to capture this HOA is basically the hot V clay loam, and we can see that that has a higher conductivity compared to the HNA, which is the Haskins loam in the region. Then the OTB are basically sandy soils, and we expect the sandy soils to have lower electrical conductivity compared to the clay soils, where you see higher electrical conductivity and everything that's in between. That gave us some level of confidence to say, okay, it looks like our electrical conductivity data sets look reliable. At least we can validate it with the soil map of the region. Now we want to see how it relates, how our electrical conductivity or apparent electrical conductivity relates to the soil properties that we measure. Now, as expected, we saw a very strong correlation between soil moisture and our electrical conductivity, similar relationship between organic matter, and of course, texture drives it. Bulk density showed the least relationship, which of course we understand that we didn't expect much relationship between bulk density and apparent electrical conductivity. If this relationship holds, and of course, having tested this relationship statistically, just to be sure to be sure that we're not just looking at correlation and interpreting that to be causation, we tested that statistically and we were satisfied. We wanted to say, can we use a simple predictive model? So maybe use a hold one out model validation technique to see if we can predict at least two of these soil properties, moisture content and organic matter. And this is what we have if we predict the moisture content based on the geophysical signal. We plot that against the moisture content that we measured in the laboratory on the samples that we collected, and plotted that on a one-to-one plot, and you could see that our model is doing pretty well with the root mean square and even the RPD that we use to quantify, to typically use to assess the model. Now, what I wanted to show us is this, that if I had relied on what we typically do during our environmental investigation or soil, trying to understand soil property distribution, we collect different samples and take to the lab, or we install sensors and simply do interpolation. Well, you could improve this by doing some more fancy geostatistical interpolation. But we see that our model, our geostatistical model here, is suffering from this spatial disconnect, right? We can improve this model by looking at the geophysics-derived properties. So this becomes the distribution of moisture content at the site derived from the geophysics. And this is the distribution of organic matter content that we derived from the geophysical measurement. Now, I want to pause there to really say that what my students and I have actually tried to show here is that the reliability, we've tried to assess the reliability of using this type of proxy measurements to predict soil property distribution at our site. And we see that this holds also for these coastal systems that we're working on, particularly for this wetland in this case. Now, one of the things I didn't show you is that, well, apparent electrical conductivity is showing correlation with soil moisture at the same time with organic matter. But the soil scientist knows that there is a co-correlation between the moisture content and organic matter. That means, is there a way we can decouple the effect of this? So what we actually, my student and I, set up to investigate was really to try to see how we can decouple this co-correlation of organic matter and soil moisture, and see how we can use, or we wanted to really assess their effect on the electrical conductivity of the soil. To do this, we actually had to go into the theoretical framework. And our question was really that if there are limits to the current theoretical models that are being used and applied to these unconsolidated soil, because most of these models were developed for rocks and saturated brine saturated systems, and we wanted to test how applicable they are to soil and if we can rely on these models for prediction. To do that, I wanted to introduce you a little much more deeper into what electrical conductivity really is. Now, what we've been measuring as electrical conductivity we've found out that that is a complex function. And if you take your mind back again to high school mathematics, you recall that a complex function has two segments. One is the real part. We have decided to call it the real. I sometimes tell students that why not take it as the y-axis? If you can, as the ordinal, no, let's say that is the x-axis, the real part. And the imaginary part, which we say is an imaginary number, but just imagine that to be the y-axis. So it's just like breaking that component back into two axes, assuming it was a vector, and it becomes an x and y-axis component. But in this case, we still call it the real and imaginary component. Now, what I want to point out is that the real component captures the electrolytic conduction, which is the movement of charges through fluid in soil, while the imaginary component reveals how much charge is stored within the electrical double layer. The electrical double layer of a soil is nothing but when you look at the soil grains, you actually, between the fluid and the grains, you have charge accumulation on the surface. And of course, if you have a charge on the surface, that charge tries to attract opposite polarity charge to it. And of course, that brings in charge accumulation, and the concentration of that charge accumulation on the surface reduces. And if you find this within grains, it leads to areas where you have within the portrait, where you have smaller portrait, you will find a lot of charges accumulating there. That is really the concept of electrical polarization that we are trying to quantify. And the only way we do that is to really look at the electrical conductivity that we measure and say it's a function of both. It has both a real component and an imaginary component. I'll be talking more on these equations later on as I proceed. So what we did was to take these same samples at the site where I just showed you that relationship. We took the sample to the laboratory and we did some spectra-induced polarization measurement. What was spectra-induced polarization? What we're practically doing is that we want to find out if we inject current and measure the potential, is there charge storage? If there is, can we quantify that? That was one thing we were. Then another thing we wanted to see was, okay, what's the surface conductivity? And are there other electrical quantities that we needed to know? And one of it is the formation factor. So if I need to know the formation factor and the surface conductivity, I probably need to do that experiment in the lab by measuring the conductivity of the soil at different fluid conductivity. So I just need to change the conductivity of the fluid that I'm passing through the soil. That will help me know what the formation factor is. And why do I want to know the formation factor? If I plot this change in conductivity against the fluid conductivity that I'm changing, it gives me the inverse of that slope will give me the formation factor, and the intercept of any slope I get will give me the surface conductivity that I talked about. And once I know these two things, and I know my polarization. The polarization, remember I said, is the imaginary conductivity. What I would have done is I've practically broken down the electrical conductivity model that we're talking about. Good. So I'll show you quickly some of the results that we've seen from this and look at the implication of this result. So what I'm really showing you is the measurements on these soil samples where we've seen the real component of the electrical conductivity, and you could see that the real component is not changing. The imaginary component seems to show some spectral behavior as we run it across different frequency. All right, this is the imaginary conductivity that we derive from the phase measurement. And if we measure the conductivity of the soil at different fluid conductivity, this is the type of graph that we have. And I say that the intercept position becomes, the slope of that intercept becomes the formation factor. So we could estimate the formation factor of the soil, while the slope of it, while the intercept, the slope rather of the curve gives me the formation factor, while the intercept will give us the surface conductivity, the real surface conductivity. Now that I have these quantities, now I want to go back again to assess that relationship that I showed you earlier between conductivity and soil properties. Now, this time, I'm looking at the real conductivity now because now I have the ability to break that conductivity that I measured into two quantities, the real and the imaginary. Now, you see that the real conductivity shows similar relationship even at different frequency as we've seen before, which is what we've seen before in the field. But now let's look at the imaginary conductivity. Now, all of a sudden, I see that at lower frequencies, I don't see any relationship between the imaginary conductivity and soil properties for this type of wetland soils. And that was very puzzling for us. But if you look at higher frequency, we see now a strong relationship between the conductivity and the soil moisture content. The same thing with organic matter. And even if we look at texture, we see the same thing. Now, what this result is practically telling us is that all these wetland soils that we are seeing don't show significant charge storage if you are only looking at the current at lower frequencies. For you to see that charge storage, you have to look at the soil, the current movement at higher frequency as we see here. So the summary of that is, even though we set up, let me pause there and really clarify that. Even though what we set out earlier on was we wanted to look at the electrical models that are being used to see how we could try to, in the future, try to decouple the effect of moisture content and the organic matter. But what we ended up seeing was, wait, Kennedy, the electrical model itself should be revised, or we should at least be aware that the imaginary conductivity shows frequency dependence. And that is what we're seeing here, that if there is a frequency dependence and we are expecting to decouple that just using the bulk conductivity, we may not be able to solve that problem. Good. So that's one of the thing I wanted to run you through, how we've used electrical conductivity to try to look at soil. Then briefly, I want to show you one more application of geophysics in this coastal system, which is something a lot of us may have seen me share before. And that is really looking at coastal systems and say, is there a way, knowing fully well that if you are looking at a saline coast margin, you have effect of both fresh water and salt water affecting the soil, and that means that both saturation and salinity of the soil could be changing. Is there a way we can measure changes in soil saturation and soil salinity at a high spatial scale beyond what we are used to? What we typically do is to use soil sensors. If we install Teros 12, for example, we will measure electrical conductivity, we will measure moisture content, and we tend to interpolate it. But for a site like Tempest, where we even have a lot of soil sensors, that's 5 meter by 5 meter that we have sensors. We still don't do a good job trying to capture the processes happening within the soil, because we know that those processes have a very higher resolution than we are capturing them. So what we wanted to see is, can we use geophysical methods that have higher spatial resolution to capture these changes in moisture content and salinity in soil? So now the focus here, what we are used to in geophysics is practically showing this type of images and say we have higher conductivity here and lower at another region. But the focus here is really to see how we can convert these to quantitative estimates of moisture content and salinity. So I will run quickly. A lot of us, several of us here are familiar with the COMPASS experiment, where we picked a site and we are simulating coastal flooding by flooding a freshwater plot and an estuary water plot with fresh water and estuary water simultaneously. And we've been doing that for the past 3 years. So I'm not going to dwell there. What I just want to show you is that we picked a transect across this and we measured both the electrical resistivity and induced polarization, which is the charge storage, which I've told you is the same thing as imaginary conductivity. We measure them over time and also have locations where there are soil sensors that measure the salinity of the soil, which is electrical conductivity of the soil, and the moisture content of the soil. And this is really one of those experiments that we have seen over time. And what I'm showing you here is really how the geophysical signature, in this case, electrical conductivity, is changing in the soil. And you see, this was during one of those times when we flooded the site. And what we see is really that our conductivity is changing in a way that reflects what we expected to see with our flooding. You see that the conductivity increased. Remember, I showed you that conductivity is linearly related to moisture content. We saw that linear relationship, and that's what we are seeing here as well, that the conductivity directly scales with increase in moisture content. We could also look at this site. I showed you that the freshwater plot and the saltwater plot they occur side by side, or we place them side by side, meaning at this other point where you see this blue color, what you are really seeing is more of the saltwater plot. And if we look at that plot and see how the bulk conductivity is changing, you could see that the conductivity is soaring over 500%, right? So bulk conductivity here is 200, while here you're seeing it as just 11 millisiemens per meter, but here you're seeing about 200 millisiemens per meter. So what we've practically showed is that changes in geophysical variables that we measure reflect the quantities that we are interested in. For example, we picked one of the soil sensors at the site and just plotted the change in moisture content and also plotted our change in conductivity. And you could see that even though we have some disconnect, the pattern appear very similar, and even the magnitude appear very similar when we compared both of them. Now, but remember, what we set up to accomplish was really to see how we can bring out the value of moisture content and salinity, so saturation and salinity, from this geophysical variable. That makes us to invoke the petrophysical relationship that we already know. And Weller et al. Has told us before that in the literature, we've seen that imaginary conductivity is proportional, is affected by salinity. So we wanted to invoke that same relationship that we know before, but then we wanted to look at the imaginary conductivity if it tells us something. What I showed you before was the real conductivity. Now we are looking at imaginary conductivity, which is nothing but polarization. So we can say we are actually looking at the polarization of the soil during the flooding. And if you see, if I highlight this section, you could see that the changes in this section, mostly at the upper part of the soil, seems to be very high. And that is where we know that the salinity, the saline water, is having a very strong impact. So what we did was to try to extract the imaginary conductivity, which is the polarization at this section of the soil, and also compare it with what our sensors were measuring, the moisture content that our sensors were measuring. And we can see that there was no relationship between no significant relationship between imaginary conductivity, the polarization, and moisture content. But if we check the polarization and the soil salinity, we see a strong relationship. And this is a power law function. So what we did was, can we go back to the lab and try to use the conductivity and the polarization? Because we see that the conductivity tells us something about saturation, while the polarization tells us something about salinity. So can I use the conductivity and the polarization to extract, to quantify spatial variation in saturation and salinity? So to do that, we try to bring out the petrophysical relationship here, and we say, we know that the conductivity is a function of this. We know the fluid conductivity. Remember, I showed you that way we estimate the formation factor, and we can also estimate the surface conductivity from the laboratory samples. Then we could also do the same. If we know the conductivity of the fluid, if we know the imaginary conductivity, we can estimate the conductivity of the fluid. And we took samples to the lab, did the laboratory experiment to estimate this quantity. And at the end of the day, what we did was to come up with the factors, these factors that help us to be able to use this petrophysical relationship. Now, once we have these measurements done, then what we can actually do, which is what I wanted us to focus on, is to move from just showing images of geophysical variables to showing images of variation in the soil property of interest. In this case, what I'm showing is really moisture content changes in our soil down to a depth of about 6 meters using the geophysical data set. So I'm no longer showing you change in resistivity anymore, but I'm showing you changes in moisture content derived from the geophysics. I could do the same thing. So one of the way we validated these uh, uh, our model was to try to compare what we have done, what our model is producing, our estimated moisture content, with the moisture content that we measure in the site using our Teros probes. And this is really for moisture content. And you can compare the moisture content in red, which is what we measure with the data logger, and the blue one is what we predicted using the geophysical quantity. Now, the same thing we checked for the a couple of the probe rather. So this is one probe, and this is another probe at another location, and we see that our model seems to be doing well. Now, we've done the same thing with imaginary conductivity, which is the polarization, and we actually show that this is how our soil salinity is changing, particularly in the area that we flooded with estuary water. Now, because of time, I'm going to skip this, but really what I wanted to show briefly here was that because we are able to measure geophysics across a long spatial scale, and we've been repeating this over the years, we are seeing that just repeated flooding of a system is changing our soil. And I'll be glad to discuss this if someone is interested in it, but I wanted to round off by showing you two things. And one of it is really that one, though we've shown that geophysics uh, is finding use in investigating or trying to understand the soils across our coastal system, it is not without challenges. And one of the challenges, the temporal scale at which we want to give data to the ecosystem scientists to be able to parameterize their models, right? One of the challenges that, I mean, geophysics is fast, we claim, but because it's not autonomous, you will have to be repeating the measurement, and someone has to be at the site to repeat those measurements. And the first year you could see our spatial resolution or temporal resolution was very poor. The second year we tried to improve it, and you can see that the number of measurements we took was really better. The third year we even did better. Now, but that is not without the problem of getting to sleep at the site, midnight, do measurements at all times. So, but what we're trying to do now is to take advantage of technology of automatic system to kind of automate our geophysical measurement to improve this temporal resolution of these measurements that we are taking. Now, I want to stop the presentation here today by just showing you that this bringing geophysics into imaging of or imaging of soil at coastal interface gives us really that opportunity of realizing this division of critical zone investigation that we've talked about before. Really, what we're talking about here is there a way we can connect what we are finding at below ground and connect them with above ground? And that is really the next phase that we are looking up to. I'll pause here and I'll be willing to take a question, and thank you for listening to the talk.